Hey, I thought I'd do a bookshelf vid, although the books are not on my shelf, they're on my foldable desk. These are some interesting books that I would recommend to anybody. They relate to horror cinema per se, even the antecedents of it and the music in it. But they're all interesting little areas of film and the macabre that are all but forgotten now, or or have a very narrow there's a very narrow range of interest in them, and these are some of I really these are books I got relatively recently in the last couple of years or so, maybe the last 2 years, and they really I learned so much stuff from that, which in the end what the book is supposed to do. They're very information dense. The Grand Guignol, right, the famous French theater of horror. This book is really it's divided up into the history of it. They actually talk about the technical aspects of how to stage these plays. Of course, the Grand Guignol plays were um, very Poe influenced, very realist, naturalist influenced, kind of not as much supernatural stuff, but just like human beings doing horrible things to each other and showing it, showing the blood, the guts, the gouged out eyes, the insanity, the decadence, showing all that on stage in a small French theater at the end of one of those little streets. Uh, the other half of the book is actually the actual transcripts in English of the plays, of what the actors would follow, the characters and the action in italics and the dialogue. Right? Really cool. I learned a lot from this. My favorite one here is an adaptation of Octave Morbeau. I think I'm really mispronouncing that. The Torture Garden, Les Jardins des Soufflés, which I'm probably mispronouncing too. This is actually really good. Very politically incorrect by today's standards. And the villain is the woman. And she gets her comeuppance at the end in a the way it's done is a combination of horror and suggestion, where you just hear her pleas at the end as the hero, who actually is just an observer, sees the justice meted out to her. Really cool book. Recommended. This book. Now this is basically this book puts forth that the musical avant-garde. Okay, pretty much Arnold Schoenberg, who actually I'm a big fan of the music and the school that he founded per se, serialism, 12-tone music. The whole idea is that you play the notes with the 12 notes in between the octaves. You have to play them randomly without repeating them, so you end up with this really weird, discordant music, which is uh, very much appropriate for horror films. Okay, and Schoenberg, he gets a lot of guff from traditionalists, but the guy always thought that he was just carrying on, Wagner's ideas. A very interesting man, also a painter. Okay? So now, the thesis of this thing is that the masses of people, okay, heard these very early, these modernist compositions that would be considered avant-garde. Well, the regular working bloke heard this music in horror films. Hammer film scores in particular, since Hammer was the most successful of those studios. And it's really cool. You go over, there's a lot of stuff I never realized about it. They actually go into the notation. I can't read music. I was learning how to read music at one point, and something happened back in the 90s. He goes over each creator, each composer. Frankel, this guy here, was it? Did the score for Curse of the Werewolf? And you can go there. It is Benjamin Frankel. You can actually go on YouTube and listen to the soundtracks of the work of these folks, and you get to hear that serialist style, okay, which is very jarring to many listeners. But for people raised on heavy metal, black metal, industrial music, and all kinds of gore grind and whatnot, it has its place. Okay? Elizabeth Lutens, I've heard a lot of her work. She actually did a lot of work for Amicus Films, and also a couple of Hammer films too. Another one with Oliver Reed. There he is, Ollie Paranoiac, which I'm probably mispronouncing too. Really interesting woman. And a lot of her original compositions are on YouTube. You can type in the name of a lot of these folks, like Benjamin Frankel or Elizabeth Lutyens, and you can listen to the music and you can hear for yourself. You know? And there's also a really cool chapter because these are serialism is classical music in the end. Right? They have also something on, of course, the great James Bernard. Okay? They did so much of the music for Hammer, the Dracula theme, which is everybody knows if you're a big fan. Really classy gent. And they do a section here. These two guys, the guy that did the Italian guy that did the music for the most successful Hammer film, the 1 million BC, Mario Nascimini, okay? Music Concrete, and God, Raquel Welch is so gorgeous. The tape music that was very popular, but the French had started, okay? And it's interesting. You can listen to all these soundtracks on YouTube. Okay? They also cover another great electronic music pioneer, Tristram Cary. He did orchestral music too, like Blood for the Mummy's Tomb, one of my favorite films. A really good Egyptian type score, but he did a lot of stuff for Doctor Who. A lot of original compositions that you could all hear on YouTube, or BitChute, I guess. And it's interesting that he made his electronic studio out of spare equipment that he had. He was in the RAF during the war, and he had all this radar equipment, oscillators, and of course the German invention of the tape recorder was taken after the war and combined with all these other things to create an early electronic music studio. And there's a bunch of people doing this, and this is parallel investigations into the sound, which I argue electronic music is probably the best for these kind of genre films. And of course, on the money side, of course, the irony was that these composers worked for cheap, relatively cheap. Okay, and eventually, of course, the electronic music was even cheaper. You didn't even have to hire an orchestra anymore. So it went very well with horror films and the low budgets too. So great book, and it's what's her name from Curse of the Werewolf. The Haunted Screen by Lotte Eisner. Now this is a really interesting book. I like the first chapter where Lotte covers a lot of the idea of the German spirit, the idea of darkness, right? A little Nietzschean stuff here. He maintains that German is not. He becomes. He is forever in the process of evolving between civilization and barbarism. Okay? And there's other interesting quotes here, right? Nordic man is constantly aware of the presence of a veil between himself and nature. That's what I keep getting at. The pagan reflex of the atmosphere in horror. Okay? He aspires after abstraction in art, inwardly discordant, always striving for the unattainable. And as she goes on, she talks about the history of it. There's a lot of great photos in here. The idea of darkness, light, Max Reinhardt's theater theories applied to the films. Just really great. Of course, there's the great, one of my favorite films, Faust, the scene with the devil about to unleash the plague on a German city miniature. There's some things in it too. She doesn't like, like the women who were directors in here. Of course, Riefenstahl and what's her name, von Tharbo. She has a lot of, as a woman, she seems to have a kind of a problem with them in addition to the historical problem. But regardless, it's a great book. Probably one of the best books written on this. I mean, German cinema at that time was so... your horror cinema really comes from that, pretty much. And speaking of horror cinema, this is a Scottish book, The Birth of the American Horror Film. This dude, man, all props to him. The amount of notes and research that this guy put into this to find hundreds upon hundreds of early macabre-themed American films, all from the late 1800s up until 1915. A lot of the Edison stuff, the Mary Queen of Scots, the Execution, which you used to see in one of those kinetoscopes at like a Nickelodeon. he really does a good job. Now there's some PC stuff in this, but it is all film studies, right? That's par for the course. And this film has survived. You can see this on YouTube. The Red Spectre. Um, he goes over the antecedents of it, the theater, the literature of horror, and there's enough stuff just in the pre-cinema setup that it's just amazing. I mean, I'm gonna go back to this book a lot. I knew some of this stuff, but this guy went to another level, man. Very impressive work. You should get this. Even visual culture, the intermediary, where you have photography, you have double exposures, you have spectroscopes, magic lanterns, the phantasmagoria, right? The famous phantasmagorias, the moving slides for the magic lanterns, into the final moving pictures, right? Which is photography put at 18 frames a second, and now a whole new world opens up. And he actually goes chapter by chapter of themes. He'll go over supernatural creatures. Look at that. I'd love to see this film. Look at that poster, The Vengeance of Egypt, 1912. The goth in me just loves this, but you also have everything about the different chapters of the different creatures and whatnot. This alone is recommended. Now, of course, the bittersweet part of this is what? What do you know about silent cinema? Many of these films literally are ghosts. They don't exist anymore. They're lost. Okay. Now, occasionally, the lost film is found, like the Edison Frankenstein, which is like finding gold. But the majority of films in this that he describes are lost forever. And you're lucky if you've never photographed them. And of course, a side note, here's a recommended film. And you can see this on YouTube also. The Italian 1911 Dante's Inferno. It took 3 years to film, so it was being filmed in like 1909. It's about an hour long. It was one of the longer films, and it's horrific. The Gustave Doré influenced devil eating, the person. Just so much into this. There's so much stuff in here. Recommended. Highly recommended. And I just found this just going around Amazon and just seeing what they had. So, and finally, I got this Japanese cinema going all the way from 1898. Now, a lot of you want to talk about lost films, right? The intro is great. It explains too that in addition to the ravages of time, the vast majority of films described in this were wiped out in the Tokyo firebombing. Okay, the largest single killing event in history. I keep telling you, and they go over that, and you see how the fodder, the Japanese supernatural mythology, is hugely extensive and was used frequently in the very beginning of cinema, as all people does. Cinema itself back then was almost otherworldly. Okay. So many of the early films, this is like a photo of a kabuki play. So you had a lot of early kabuki stuff. You had the women roles being played by men. And you have these wood blocks that are really cool, showing the bizarre and the horrific themes that would come later. But the Japanese eventually started to modernize. And you start to see, and the photos in this are just great. You get a lot of these ape-man movies. You get, of course, ghosts. You get something like this. This is influenced by Caligari. You get this film is on YouTube. I've seen that. It's like a really modernist Japanese film set in an asylum with masks. Right? You got the White Peril films, right, where the White Devils are messing with Japan and they ain't having it, which is actually kind of cool. A lot of the early horror themes actually are referenced. The creatures come from Dutch alchemy, but you also have the ghosts, the prostitute that wants revenge. You got the furry attacking me. That's scary. You got ninjas. You got martial arts, and you have Western style robots. You got more White Peril films. Those devils. And of course, one of the things I'll say real quick, one of the ubiquitous supernatural creatures, which approximates the vampire, the Japanese vampire, is associated with cats. So if you're a cat lover, you're a damn vampire lover if you're in Japan. And you have tons of these films of these vampire cat demon creatures. And they're usually females. So, and the yokai, of course. great, amazing book, right? You got pro Imperial Japan cartoons for the kids. Right? Great stuff, man. Great stuff. The past looks a lot more interesting uh, than the future, but recommend it. Get these books, man. Later.